It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative peer Daniel Hannan, the Labour MP and chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Diana Johnson, the former First Minister of Northern Ireland, Arlene Foster, and the Observer columnist, Sonia Soda. Today, a reset at number 10. The new faces are reporting for duty, but will it be enough to save the Prime Minister? Also today, why is the Home Office spending £4.7 million a day on hotels for asylum seekers and refugees?
We are looking, as part of the new plan for immigration, work on reception centres. We should not be housing people in hotels.
Northern Ireland's politics once again in turmoil. We speak to a former First Minister. And is it misogynistic to suggest that Carrie Johnson influences her husband's decision-making?
This whole focus on Carrie Johnson and some of these reports, I think it's very undignified and very unfair.
So let's start with the story you heard there at the top of the headlines, asking the question there on the Times front page. Johnson hits reset button with a new number 10 team. Yes, this is in part response to the Sue Gray report into Downing Street parties that came out, and also following 5 high-profile resignations from the Downing Street operation. Now, we understand there are more changes to come in terms of personnel at Downing Street. But let's start with that question. Is this reset going to work, Dan?
Well, it's obviously in response to the Sue Gray report, which calls for it, more or less, says that you can't carry on with Downing Street as structured. But I think there have been problems in how the machinery of government has been operating long before then. You could see it, actually, during the response to the pandemic. If you contrast the vaccine rollout, which went extremely well, with the fiascos we had over PPE...
Is that because it was run by the NHS and not by government?
Fundamentally, one lot went through all of the usual machinery, the Public Health England, NHS procurement, and failed. It was immobilist and a rusty, inept machine. The other lot was somebody who was brought in and told to get on with it. So I think there is a real problem with how government is operating, and if this is an opportunity to reset that, then I think that's got to be for the good.
Diana, is this reset going to work for Boris Johnson?
Well, I think the real problem is at the top of government. It's Boris Johnson that's the real problem in this. So I'm not sure that this reset is actually going to deliver what the Prime Minister thinks it will. And I am rather confused with some of the appointments, you know, a cabinet minister, chief of staff and a constituency MP. That's Steve Barclay. Huge workload for Steve Barclay. I mean, how that is going to work, I just think that it reminds me actually a bit of what was happening in the Trump regime, when people seem to be coming and going at a great rate of knots.
Well, Arlene, has Boris Johnson run out of road, or is it, in the words of the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng, who's appealed to his party to give him the time and space to deliver?
Well, we have a saying in Northern Ireland, you should never waste a good crisis. And this is an opportunity, I think, for Boris Johnson. And I said this in a piece I wrote back in December, actually, that he needed to really get a grip on the operation of Downing Street. So I suppose in one way, he is sending out a very clear message that that is what he is attempting to do. I do have to agree with the Steve Barclay appointment. However, I find it a bit strange that someone who holds the ministerial office in the Cabinet Office, and having worked with the Cabinet Office closely from a devolved administration point of view, that's a huge job. And I'm not sure how he's going to be able to be Chief of Staff and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and a constituency MP. So maybe we will see some changes there in the Cabinet Office. I have no difficulty with the Chief of Staff attending Cabinet meetings, because I think he needs to, in order to have that connectivity with the Cabinet and also with the backbenchers. But I do think expecting him to be Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Chief of Staff is an enormous responsibility.
Yeah, he's going to be a very busy man, Steve Barclay. Sonia, in general, do you think it's going to work, this?
No, I think this is a rearranging of the deck chairs and none of the fundamentals have changed, which we've got a Prime Minister who's mired in political crisis, stands accused of huge political hypocrisy. The Met Police are investigating him for allegedly breaking COVID laws and regulations. And his polls have really taken a dive with the public as a result. And he's got a party who's mobilising against him. So none of the fundamentals have changed when you take a step back. At the end of the day, Boris Johnson might last a week, he might last a month, he might last a few months. But I think his political future is looking very worrying for him indeed.
Right, well, let me give you a flavour of one of the appointments because Gito Harry, who has been appointed as Director of Communications, you saw him also in the headlines, has given an interview to a Welsh language magazine. Let's just show you the headline. It says, Boris Johnson takes a knee and sings "I Will Survive" when appointing his new Director of Communications. In the interview, Gito Harry, who worked with Boris Johnson when he was Mayor of London, said that when they met and he was offered and appointed the role of Director of Communications, he said, "I walked in and gave a salute and said, 'Prime Minister, Gito Harry reporting for duty.' The Prime Minister stood up and saluted back, but then replied, 'What am I doing? I should take the knee for you.' Mr Harry then asked Mr Johnson if he would survive, to which Mr Johnson replied by singing lines from the Gloria Gaynor song, 'I Will Survive.' The pair then sang lyrics of the song back and forth to each other before sitting down for a serious discussion. Love to be a fly on the wall. He also went on to say, Gito Harry that is, he's not all that clownish, the Prime Minister, but he's a very likeable character. High hopes for the reorganisation, Dan?
Well, I mean, that's everyone who knows Boris will be unsurprised by that. He can rarely resist a joke.
Have you ever broken into song with Boris Johnson when you've met him?
Yeah, yes, he particularly liked the theme song, as I recall, of Hong Kong Phooey. Do you remember Hong Kong Phooey? He was always singing that. He has a largeness of character, a generosity of spirit, which I think is quite appealing. And I just want to come back to what the fundamentals. Yeah, I don't think that the real fundamentals are what Sonia said. I think the real fundamentals are, we came out of the lockdown before anyone else because we not once but twice won the race for vaccination. We have the fastest growing economy of any major
But it's an
country.
economy that also shrank the sharpest in 2020.
These are fundamentals, right? It seems to me. And if Boris does a bad job on those things, fine, then people will take a view about that. But it seems to me that those are significantly more important than appointments. And I think
the issue is you don't get to tell voters what's important. One thing we know from the expenses scandal is voters hate political hypocrisy. They can't stand it. And I'm afraid that Boris Johnson attending parties in Downing Street in number 10 that happened on multiple occasions now we know when people were making huge sacrifices, that is not something that you are able to say to the public, that doesn't matter, that's not the important stuff. That is for the voters to judge.
He has attended loads of parties and then lied about it to Parliament, he will have to resign, right? There's no question about that. But that, I don't think we're in a position to anticipate what's being looked into in detail now, right? And I think we should, the presumption of innocence is not just a piety. Can I just say one thing about the appointments, though? Because the idea that, Steve Barclay doesn't have the time to do this, I always find this a rather puzzling argument. I mean, MPs are expected to do lots of other things. Tony Blair was MP for Sedgefield and managed to run a nuclear-armed G7 country, right? It's not. I don't think the real issue is timing. I think that the question is about bringing together government in a way that will function and bringing the Cabinet Office and Number 10 together and having an MP there who other MPs can talk to. All right. I mean, he's pretty well liked and pretty well respected.
Well, let's get other people.
Will improve.
All right. Well, we get that point about bringing it together, making it more streamlined and efficient.
But if you look at people who've actually done the job of being chief of staff, chief executive to the Prime Minister, people like Lord Barwell, people like Jonathan Powell, people are saying this is something that just will not work. There's all sorts of problems with it. And I do think timing is an issue. If you're a cabinet minister, you have a very full diary on top of your constituency details. Added on to that, then, running the Prime Minister's office, I just think that's really asking too much of one individual. And the idea that he's going to be in touch with MPs, Steve Barclay's going to have this conversation with MPs is nonsense as well, because he's going to be in number 10 all the time, trying to get that sorted out.
There is still going to be a civil service type person doing the logistics of it.
All right. Well, let's move off Steve Barclay, because I think most viewers probably don't know precisely who he is. They may do, though, in months to come or weeks to come. Arlene, you were smiling at the beginning as I was reading the anecdote or the interview section on Gitto Harry. What did it make you think of? Convey a lack of seriousness or not?
No, it made me think of the time that the Prime Minister sang "Come on, Arlene" to me, which of course is a take on the Dixie Midnight Runners song "Come on, Eileen."
Indeed,
so,
it did. Did you cringe at the time?
That the Prime Minister has done some singing. But look, I mean, Dan's absolutely right. The PM is someone who has a sense of fun, but he also, and even in that piece you read out, he knows then to get on with the job and to do the work. And I mean, I don't think we should criticise someone for having a sense of fun. Often in politics, I think people nowadays don't have any sort of character outside of I've been accused of this, of being too serious and not having a personality and all of that sort of thing. So actually, I think it's a good thing that the PM has a personality and doesn't take himself too seriously all of the time.
Diana?
Well, there's nothing wrong with having a sense of fun and enjoying a sing. I mean, I worked with Ed Balls. He was great for karaoke and had a great sense of humour. But actually, it's about delivery. You want the Prime Minister to be across the detail. You want him to be running that government. And at the moment, it just seems to me that it's chaos and incompetence. And, you know, having a sense of fun is all very well, but that's not going to deliver in the way that we all want the government to deliver. Post-COVID, post-Brexit, there's a serious job of work to be done. And Boris Johnson's failing.
All right, just before we move on, part of the reset was supposed to be a big announcement today on the plan to start clearing the huge backlog in the NHS, 6 million people waiting for routine operations. Now, the Treasury's been blamed for kiboshing the announcement today. It may, in fact, come out later on. The important part of that, of course, is that the money to be raised to pay for this and then go into social care is on the increase in national insurance contributions. But this is a tweet that was put out by Matthew Taylor from the NHS Federation saying, increasingly getting the sense that Boris Johnson now faces the same but more intense and short-term challenge Tony Blair had in his third term, namely that HMT, the Treasury, is loath to agree to any number 10 plans involving money, as the Chancellor sees these as opportunistic and wasted on a dying administration. What do you make of that?
Well, the NHS is currently, for obvious reasons, getting more cash in a shorter time than it's ever had. It would be extraordinarily irresponsible not to make sure that it was being well and wisely spent. And we should be absolutely certain that we're prudent with every extra penny. We've got, I think it's an extra 5.4 billion just for the backlog, and that's not counting the stuff that was already going in. Of course, it's important to make sure that we are getting as much return on that investment as possible. People would expect nothing less.
Sonia?
I think you have to look at this in the big picture. So when you look at NHS funding, first of all, we spend less per head on our healthcare than many equivalent countries. We have, well, that's if you look at the 2020 figures, which take into account pandemic spending, when the UK had to spend a huge amount because it didn't have existing public health infrastructure in the same way that countries like Germany has. If you look at 29 and before that, we spend less than equivalent countries. We have fewer nurses and doctors per head than equivalent countries. We have far fewer hospital beds per head. Now, if you look at NHS funding, since 2010, the NHS has been structurally underfunded. And if you speak to people who work in the NHS, you hear stories about how that has led not only to recruitment shortages, but a huge backlog, for example, in the quality of machinery that the NHS uses. So, you know, we had big NHS waiting lists going into this pandemic. The pandemic is part of the story, but underfunding is also another very significant element.
Let me point you to a different story. This is the BBC News headline. A UK hotel bill for 37,000 migrants, actually £4.7 million a day, says the Home Office. Diana, you're the new chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. What did you make of these figures? Because the Home Office had to revise its original figure of the cost of hotels for asylum seekers per day from 1.2 million to 4.7 million pounds.
They did, and it's fair to say that the issue of hotels has been an ongoing issue, the use of hotels. The Home Secretary says she doesn't want to use hotels, but we're still using hotels. And in fact, that figure, I think, is quite striking, that it had to be revised from what we were told at the committee. We were told 1.2 million, and then it was revised. So the issue is that this isn't new, and I don't understand why the Home Office hasn't had a grip on this in the years that this has been building up. Now, we know, obviously, with COVID, that's put a different problem and dimension on how you house asylum seekers and the dispersal of asylum seekers. But this, again, is about delivery. The Home Office now have a backlog of about 67,000 asylum claims that they haven't made any decision on yet. We know that asylum claims have doubled in recent years. So why haven't the Home Office been able to plan and get in place?
When you say plan, get in place, get a grip, what are you suggesting?
Well, I think one of the big issues is their relationship with local authorities. One of the big complaints I hear is local authorities saying they're not part of any discussions with the Home Office. The Home Office often will put asylum seekers into areas where there's cheap housing or cheap hotel use. There's no... and the LGA, the Local Government Association, have said there needs to be much more of a conversation between the Home Office and local councils. And also the other issue is about having enough staff in the Home Office to actually deal with asylum claims in a timely way. Any constituency MP will tell you they have claims going back years and years and years. That's not good for us. It's not good for the asylum seeker. We need to get that sorted out.
I mean, people watching the programme will probably be quite aghast at the idea it's costing £4.7 million a day. But then what is the alternative to hotel accommodation for asylum seekers?
Well, I think the alternative is to tackle the problem at source and do something about the asylum regime. This is an unpopular view, but I'm a supporter of controlled legal immigration. I think there should be more of it. But we have a huge problem when we have, as I just said, this doubling of figures largely of people coming from safe countries, coming from safe EU countries. And as long as we have the legal apparatus in place that says that anyone who claims asylum has to be treated in this particular way, I think we're always going to have this bureaucratic nightmare and these expenses. And we need to have the courage to say the current regime, designed in 1951, is no longer suited to the modern world and it needs to be reformed.
So you would like to see the list of official government schemes, there are 6 of them in total, you'd like to see those massively expanded?
I would like to see more safe legal routes for people to come and bring their skills and talents here. I also think that we have to stop the current situation where the only way to guarantee yourself an asylum claim is to try and reach this country by sea, which pushes people into these unsafe routes, puts them in the hands of people smugglers, and as well as the danger to them, then clogs up our system at the other end. I think every successive Home Secretary, including under the last Labour government, has tried to do something about that, and they keep running up against this sort of network of constraints and conventions and so on, which in the end we're going to have to do something about.
Sonia?
Again, I think we need to take a step back and put this in context. So if you look at our numbers of asylum claims, they're actually lower than they were in the early 2000s. And we get far fewer asylum claims per person than countries like Germany and France, for example. We have an international obligation under international law that people, when they reach here and when they seek asylum, that we have to consider their claims. The majority of people seeking asylum in the UK, their claims are successful because they're coming from countries like Afghanistan, from countries like Syria. So I think it's really important to look at how we treat people when we get here. People have to subsist on just over £5 a day. They're not allowed to...
What about the ones who are coming from France?
No, but hang on, let's concentrate on...
International law says that international law says you have the right to claim asylum in the country that you want to. We're actually, we chose to leave the EU. It's not as though the EU's regulations around this were working particularly well anyway, but we've chosen to leave the EU. We have international obligations as a sovereign country under international law. I think the way that we treat people when they get here, though, they're not allowed to work. There are some countries, and let's not forget that the vast majority of refugees in the world live in low-income countries that surround their home countries. And in some of those countries, they're allowed to work. Yet we don't allow asylum seekers, some of whom are very highly skilled, to work and pay their own way.
And we'll come on to your point in just a moment about where the first safe country might be. But, Arlene, in terms of actually housing asylum seekers and refugees who are fleeing fleeing persecution. The Stormont executive said it plans to rehome 840 people from Afghanistan, with 360 arriving in the first year. I mean, what are the plans that are in place to accommodate those refugees?
Well, I thought it was interesting to hear about the work with local government. I have to say, Stormont does work very closely with our local government colleagues. And actually, when we rehoused a number of Syrian refugees, that worked very well on the surface when we first looked at it. But then we realised actually that some of those Syrian refugees felt very cut off. Those who were living maybe further away from the main centres of population, from different services. I remember in my own constituency having a conversation with a chap who was an architect in Syria, and he had been relocated to Enniskillen, and he just felt so completely dislocated from anything that he could do. So we have to take into account not just our needs, but actually the needs of those who we were trying to help as well, and not just see them as a homogeneous unit. And of course, hotels are inappropriate places for families. I mean, that's very clear. And therefore, there should be more integrated work with the local government agencies. And to take Dan's point on, there has to be a complete overhaul of our system for dealing with these issues, because Brexit was about controlling immigration, not cutting off immigration, but actually controlling immigration. And I don't see any evidence that we have really taken that on board in designing a new system to deal with all of this.
Right. I mean, there was strong public support, Sonia, for rescuing Afghans in danger when Kabul fell to the Taliban last year. But do you think the public really appreciate that the reality is that these people do need to be housed, and sometimes hotels are the only option if there isn't appropriate housing for them?
Yeah, I think hotels are an inappropriate form, and councils have got to look at what they're doing. But I don't think it's just council capacity. I think it's, real infrastructure issues around housing and availability of housing. But this is the reality. I mean, the numbers of people that we've helped to come over from Afghanistan, they're very, very small. It's like a tiny drop in the ocean when you think about all the people who've helped British forces, for example, the British embassy. We know that there are still Afghans who worked with British forces trapped in Afghanistan who didn't manage to make it out. So the reality is that if you're helping people to come across and resettle them, you really need to think harder about what support you're going to provide for people to make a new life when they get here. And living in a hotel with children for months on end is not that.
Can I just interrupt to that point? Because I think it's worth saying that with the Afghan schemes, there is money attached for local authorities, for health, for education. There's assistance. For asylum seekers who are not from Afghanistan, not part of these schemes, there isn't any of that. And that's the complaint that lots of local authorities are making, that they are given people to look after and want to assist, but there's no financial support in the way there is for the Afghanistan schemes. And
what about the 2 migrant housing centres, I think, in your constituency? How do other constituents feel about that?
Well, Hull has a really proud record. We're a city that welcomes asylum seekers and refugees, absolutely. But we also, through the council, are making it very clear that we need to have a relationship with the Home Office that isn't about people just being brought to the city, but that there is discussion and debate. There's co-production, if you like, about how you look after people in an area, how you look after families and children, provide for their health needs. That's the real issue. And the other issue is that local authorities across the country, not all are taking their fair share. So the burden is on a small number of local authorities.
I think there's a huge and, to most people, obvious difference between someone coming from Afghanistan and someone coming from France, where you are unlikely to face persecution or oppression. When the Mediterranean crisis was at its height 5 years ago, I spent some time volunteering in a hostel in the south of Italy for underage migrants, for unaccompanied boys, mainly from West Africa. And these were resourceful, ambitious lads who were doing what I think any of us would do in their situation, but almost none of them was, legally speaking, a refugee. They were fleeing from poverty and corruption, not from oppression and persecution. And unless we're prepared to look at, because on the current system, almost anyone could come here and claim asylum, and it's very difficult then to remove them until we're prepared to tackle that and have a proper system in place that allows people to come here legally, but that doesn't allow people to game the system. We're always going to have this problem.
But we don't have lots of people gaming the system. When you look at the asylum system, the vast majority, the majority of applications are successful. I think there is a question, actually, if people come here and claim asylum in bad faith, then actually
they're never removed.
That's
the fundamental problem.
There are questions about that.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't let that distract from the fact that there aren't lots of people coming here and claiming asylum in bad faith. Most applications are successful, and many are actually successful on appeal when originally rejected.
I mean, what is your response with the government currently pushing ahead with its Nationality and Borders Bill? The bill will make asylum claims inadmissible if migrants come to the UK or refugees come to the UK illegally, as the government is interpreting it, such as coming across the Channel in small boats. But if you look at the sorts of treaties that we have signed up to, it doesn't say anything about the mode of transport or how refugees arrived here. They should still have the right to claim asylum. So do you support what the government is trying to do here in terms of why?
I support for the obvious reason that France is not a country where you are facing persecution. And if we are prevented from doing something that most people would regard as moderate and sensible by decades-old treaties, then we need to revise those treaties.
So Daniel, do you think that the vast numbers of refugees that we saw arrive in countries like Greece and Italy, for example, coming over the Mediterranean, you think it should just be the responsibility of Italy and Greece to deal with those refugees, those asylum seekers? You think that the UK has got no role to play when some people move across the continent and come to find their way to the UK?
Right, so
because that doesn't sound like the UK fulfilling its international obligations
and
to
is
me.
still, as you well know, Sonia, taking people directly from Syria, taking people directly from Afghanistan.
Daniel, when you take the people whom
the UN has identified as people who have a well-founded fear of persecution, right? It seems to me quite wrong to say that somebody who's been able to pay people smugglers should be able to jump the queue over those whom the UN has identified as being most in need.
So somebody who's got a genuine asylum claim comes from a country like Syria or Iran or Iraq, who did manage to make it over to Italy and then manages to make it over to the UK. You think that the UK shouldn't treat their claim for asylum fairly in the way that we would other asylum seekers?
We have so there's a certain number of people that we take directly. We try and structure that policy so that it helps those who are most in need and are most obviously with a well-founded fear of persecution. And yes, I think as long as we have a situation where anyone who arrives by sea can effectively elbow their way to the front of the queue...
I don't think that's
hang on. Arlene, can I bring you in here? Because I think Dan or Sonia mentioned this issue of returns if people's asylum claim is turned down. Do you accept that now the UK has left the EU, the past returns arrangement, of course, has fallen, and so the UK doesn't have an arrangement with any EU country as yet in terms of returning people? How big a problem is that in your mind?
Well, I do think we do have to, and I've already said, the system is not fit for purpose and has to be looked at again. But we don't do this in isolation, of course, Jo. We need to look at what's happening in France in the run-up to the French presidential election and all of their utterings around immigration. These are the great Europeans who used to lecture Northern Ireland on being good Europeans, now saying that they're going to control immigration in a way that other Europeans aren't. So I don't think we should look at this in isolation. But I mean, Sonia said that, there's not too many people that are deemed to be illegal after their hearing. Those who are, though, I am very concerned about some of the methods they use to try to get to stay here in the UK. And we heard about this just last year when some people in Liverpool were pretending to convert to Christianity in a method to try and get staying here in the UK. That is wrong, and we need to have a system to deal with that so that these people can be sent back if they are illegal immigrants, because they do come into our country and take up services in a way that then reduces services for other people. And we cannot avoid that elephant in the room.
All right, we are going to talk about the ongoing turmoil and uncertainty in Northern Ireland. Emma Vardy, our Ireland correspondent, is with us. Emma, when we last spoke to you, which was just on Thursday, that was ahead of the resignation of Paul Givan, the then First Minister. Where has that left power sharing?
Yes, it all developed pretty quickly from then on, didn't it, Jo? Well, look, First thing to say is this isn't the same as the collapse in power sharing that we saw between 2017 and 2020. Then everything fell down. Nothing was able to be progressed. The rules have changed since then. So the First Minister's resignation means there is no executive anymore, so decision-making at the highest level can't go ahead, but the Assembly still functions. Now, what that means in practice today is that the Assembly has been meeting to try to work out what bills they can get through between now and the election. They're trying to speed up the process for some of that. There's a number of pieces of important legislation that it does look like will now get across the line, things like protection from stalking here in Northern Ireland, a parental bereavement leave bill. All those things can still get through, even though you haven't got a First Minister and Deputy First Minister, because they'd already been put in motion by the executive. The things which can't get through are things which would need to go back to the First and Deputy First Minister, the executive level sign off. So that's things like the budget, which had been out to consultation, question marks over the remaining COVID restrictions. So there is a whole load of work still being done up at Stormont, but some key things that won't be. And they're thrashing all that out there, thrashing it all out up there today.
Right. And also the point of a Northern Ireland bill getting passed today, because there's obviously some crucial timing in terms of getting the executive to some extent, as you say, functioning, because elections are coming along in May.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an important reason why this isn't quite the same as when power sharing collapsed last time around. So the bill that is expected to get through at Westminster today, what that effectively means is it will allow the Assembly to keep on functioning for up to 6 months, even if there isn't a First Minister and a Deputy First Minister in charge at the top. And that is because, of course, power sharing for a long time has been very fragile here in Northern Ireland. The government had always anticipated, it was always, very possible that one side or other could pull out and collapse things. And this change in legislation at Westminster was to allow that Assembly to keep on functioning even without an executive in charge. So it's also being done retrospectively. So if that gets through at Westminster today, it means things can continue. Otherwise, under the old rules, the government collapses and then you would have needed to trigger an election within 7 days. That won't need to happen this time around.
Emma Vardy, thank you very much. Well, the executive can carry on and may well carry on. So, Arlene, what was the point of Paul Givan resigning or the DUP pulling him as First Minister?
Well, the executive doesn't continue because the First and Deputy First Minister are the only people that can call an executive. And if there's no First and Deputy First Minister, then the executive can't be called. The difference is under the sustainability rules that we negotiated.
But a lot of the functions are continued. So I ask again, because they've been accused of playing politics with this, electioneering, all internal DUP politics. That's true, isn't it?
No, I mean, if you look back at what Sir Geoffrey has been saying since he became party leader back in July of last year, he made a very significant speech in September of last year and made it very clear that if the protocol didn't go in a very substantial way, then that the Northern Ireland executive would suffer as a result. So this is, I'm actually surprised that people are surprised that the DUP have taken action, because they always have signposted they would take action. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister has decided not to deal with the issues, even though in July of last year in a command paper, the government said very clearly that the circumstances were there to trigger Article 16, to deal with the trade diversion that was happening between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to deal with the economic damage that was happening. But yet that is still in place, despite the fact that the Prime Minister called the protocol insane in Parliament 2 weeks ago.
Right.
So if something's insane, one would have thought that you should have dealt with it.
Right. Do you have sympathy with the DUP's position on this?
I have I don't disagree with a word that Arlene just spoke there. It was always absurd, this protocol, because it was based on a complete fallacy, which was that any checks on goods between Northern Ireland and Ireland were a threat to the peace, but any such checks between Northern Ireland and Great Britain were just fine and dandy. Now, that was obviously unsustainable.
Except it was something that Boris Johnson, of course, and the government signed up to and agreed.
As of course, it was always intended to be temporary, right? And it was also intrinsic in it that there were these 3 conditions where it could be suspended. And I think they've been met, right? There were 4, one of which was environmental, which hasn't. But the others, the economic damage, no one argues with that. The trade diversion, no one argues with that. And and the political instability which we're seeing now, if every unionist party is against the protocol, in a part of the world where the deal since the Belfast Agreement has been that no major changes are made without the consent of both communities, that intrinsically would be enough to stop something in almost any other context in Northern Ireland.
Do you agree with that, Diana?
I think where this gets us back to is where we started from, which is about the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister really needs to be absolutely all over this now. He negotiated the protocol. It's his fingerprints all over it. It's time for the Prime Minister to step up and to get everyone round the table and get this sorted out. I think that's the key thing.
I agree with that.
Well,
but part of sorting it out may be Article 16, right? And I think this
which is suspending it.
I think that we have to negotiate on this. But what I just want to say to Arlene was, I think Peter Kyle, who's the Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, has made it very clear that he thinks that the DUP should step back into the executive. We've only got a few weeks left before this mandate runs out. That's the position that Peter Kyle's taken. I think that's the right position.
Well, wouldn't that be a responsible position to take, Arlene?
No, yet again, I'm surprised that we're saying that there should be a negotiated settlement when we've been negotiating on this for over a year. And of course, that suits the European Union because, as Daniel will tell you, everything is long-fingered in Europe and they take years to come to decisions in relation to issues. This is an internal border in the United Kingdom. It's the single market of the United Kingdom at jeopardy whilst we protect the single market of the European Union. Single market of the European Union apparently is sacrosanct, even though there's no difference in the rules and regulations in the United Kingdom at the moment as there is in the European Union. So what is the need to have 20% of the entire European Union checks happening between Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Right, OK.
They've now said just last week that, in fact, what should be happening is that passengers who are coming across from Great Britain into Northern Ireland should have their luggage checked in case we're bringing across sandwiches from Great Britain into Northern Ireland.
Right.
That's mad.
Right. Well, it's mad, says Arlene Foster, and the DUP have taken the action they have. But, of course, the protocol was always agreed and put in place to avoid any sort of hard border on the island of Ireland. Yeah. And the interpretation is around
the hard border in the UK. We have a hard border in the UK instead.
Absolutely. But the point is, agreement couldn't be made otherwise, with the EU insisting, as Arlene was saying, that they need to keep the integrity of their single market. So are you suggesting perhaps that the whole of the UK should be much closer aligned, Sonia?
Well, I think if we care about the stability of Northern Ireland, that is where it takes us. I think what we're all talking about here is that the impossible conundrum of Brexit, which is that the very hard Brexit that Boris Johnson wanted, it's not the Brexit we voted for, we voted for Brexit, but we didn't vote for a particular type, but the type of Brexit that Boris Johnson and the right of the Conservative Party wanted was one where there'd be no regulatory alignment between the United Kingdom and the EU. It's a very extreme form of Brexit. Now, that is incompatible with both having no border on the island of Ireland and no border down the Irish Sea. It's impossible. You can't do it.
Well,
So we need to make a choice as a country. Do we want a border on the island of Ireland? Do we want a border down the Irish Sea? Or do we want the whole of the UK to be more aligned with the EU? It's
well, let's
not
put
wrong,
Arlene shaking her head.
It's the fundamental of the Brexit problem. And actually, it's parties like yours denying that to the British public that have led us to the situation that we're in today.
Arlene?
Yeah, because we have so many votes in the Westminster Parliament, don't we? Let me say, this is complete nonsense. The fact of the matter was there were alternative arrangements put forward to our own government, the European Union, to deal with these issues around small business exemptions, around trusted traders, around dealing with risk. There were the smart borders, the European Union's own determination in relation to how technology could be used to deal with risk. There were, of course, alternatives to dealing with a hard border on the island of Ireland. The problem was that Theresa May had set us on a course that meant that you couldn't have anything at all, not even technology, to deal with these issues in relation to going into the single market. So
Arlene,
it is absolutely wrong.
You resigned.
Absolutely wrong
right,
to say that.
You resigned yourself. Did you fall victim to this whole conundrum, to the Northern Ireland Protocol, because your own party wouldn't move, wouldn't compromise in any way, and you were made the scapegoat?
No, well, there were other issues in connection with why I felt it was time for me to leave the party. And when your colleagues decide that they no longer have confidence in you, it is time to move on. That is what I did in June of last year, and passed the baton on to a new leader who has the problem of dealing with the protocol. But to say that there were no alternatives to what has happened in Northern Ireland is simply not true. There was an alternative arrangements commission actually set up by the government to deal with these issues, but they were told that their suggestions were unicorn suggestions that wouldn't work. And those are the very things now that the European Union are looking at to solve the problem.
Dan, briefly.
First of all, I was very sorry to see Arlene go. I think she did a terrific job. And she's absolutely right. There were and are all these arrangements. Wow. It doesn't suit the EU to look at them. The fact that it's carrying out more checks on goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland than on the whole of its eastern frontier, the fact that it's proposing checking people's sandwiches, the fact that it wanted, rabies passports for dogs, tells us that this is not about the integrity of the single market. This is about needling and trying to get us to sign up to a whole bunch of permanent EU policies on food and other regulations.
Well, and as a sort of final note on this, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, is, I understand, meeting Maros Sefcovic from the EU later in the week. We'll see where that ends up. In the last few minutes of the programme, can I just show you this headline in the Daily Mail? Carrie Johnson's behaviour is preventing the Prime Minister leading Britain as effectively as the voters deserve, writes Lord Ashcroft, former treasurer of the Conservative Party. It's an extract based on his new book about the Prime Minister's wife, Carrie Johnson. Is that fair or sexist?
I don't know about sexist. Sexist has become sort of catch-all word. What about rude? What about ungallant? What about unfair? I mean, I really disliked this when Cherie Blair was in Downing Street. I always thought it was an incredibly low way of complaining about politics. I've never met Carrie Johnson, but it's not. Is it a kind way to be talking about someone who is a new mother and has not been elected and is a civilian?
Right. I mean, Diana, what did you make of it? I mean, these were extracts in the Sunday Times at the weekend blaming Carrie Johnson for some of the political decisions made at Number 10, criticising her involvement. What did you make of it?
Well, look, Boris Johnson's a big boy. He runs the government. It's his responsibility, the decisions that are made on behalf of his government. I just think that it's always very easy, isn't it, to blame the woman and to have this idea of a Lady Macbeth character in the background. I think it's rubbish, and we should be really focusing on Boris Johnson and his government and the decisions they are making, not about his partner. Right,
I used the word sexist, Arlene, because it was Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, who implied it was misogynistic and sexist. How did you view it?
I think there's certainly an element of sexism, and I think Dan's right to refer to Cherie Blair, because I think there were elements of the press that engaged in that sort of behaviour with Cherie Blair, who had her own life, her own professional work, and she was always seen to be an influence on her husband. But look, I mean, I'm married. We all take counsel from our closest partner. Of course we do. It's when the line is overstepped to direction that one should be worried. And I think that that's what is being alleged here. Now,
are you worried?
That's true or not true.
Right. Oh, I see.
But I do have to say that there's more than an element of sexism in this sort of allegation. The PM is a big boy, and I have to say, if he was being directed by his wife, I think that would say more about him than it would about her.
She does have an influence, arguably, Carrie Johnson, on Boris Johnson in the way that we've just heard Arlene say. What's wrong with that?
Well, of course she does. She's married to him. So, I mean, I think we're sort of all in agreement here on this panel, which is that Boris Johnson is responsible for the decisions of Boris Johnson and government. He's responsible for who he decides to take advice from. Obviously, that's going to include his wife. And I don't think it's right to sort of focus on her as an independent political player. That said, there are certain allegations about Downing Street, for example, parties that were held that are about specifically her behaviour as well as Boris Johnson's behaviour. Now, I think Boris Johnson is much more the public figure than she is, so there should be much more accountability for him. But I do think that it's legitimate for journalists to ask questions about whether she also attended illegal gatherings.
Well, that's the thing. Is it legitimate in that case? Because Sajid Javid was saying in general, no, the spouses should be off limits. But if there is some sort of influence or involvement, rightly or wrongly, on key political decisions, shouldn't Carrie Johnson face some scrutiny and questions?
Depends what you mean by legitimate. I mean, there shouldn't be a law that says that you're not allowed to write about the Prime Minister's wife. But I think that the tone in which she's attacked, I just think it's nasty, it's unchivalrous, and it's mean-minded.
I don't think there was ever with Theresa May's husband or with Dennis Thatcher. There was never an idea then that they were exerting influence, was there?
Right. Do you think there is something in that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, of course there is. Of course there's sexism at play here. And I just think this idea that people don't take advice from their partners is really far-fetched.
Well, on that far-fetched idea, thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Politics Live at 12:15. Bye-bye.